Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak about the book. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully, you can all see it, yeah? So what I'm going to talk about today is the themes of my new book, Mindshift, but it's a much bigger thing, really, in terms of what I want to talk about, because it's about how the mind works, which is obviously a major kind of question. And is there anything different about the human mind that makes it different from other animals? And also, how do ideas change in and struggle, which I'm sure is one of the most important things socialists are interested in. So just to then start off by thinking about this issue of what is consciousness, obviously a big question. It's occupied philosophers and people, scientists, thinkers, ever since we can put it, recorded history. Certainly the ancient Greeks were very interested in it. Aristotle had some ideas about the soul and what that means. And I think one of the biggest problems we really face in understanding the mind is, on the one hand, we've got this, if we are materialists, if we don't see any need for any kind of supernatural basis for the mind, we've got to explain it in material terms, which ultimately means explaining it in terms of the brain and its individual cells. But at the same time, obviously, consciousness is this incredible thing, isn't it? You think of all the kind of great works of literature and science and technology and culture that have come out of human brains, but any one of us, has the most amazing, I would say, amazing abilities. And so we've got to explain how that kind of makes sense in material terms. And another thing that I wanted to talk about is the way that biology and the environment might intersect on this. So on the one hand, we can say, well, being biological beings, our biology matters. Actually, this is a controversial question. I'll come on to talk about that. But biology matters, and we now know that genes are kind of play a key role in the biology of organisms. But clearly, we grow up in an environment, and that environment can be very different for different people, and it can change. And also, then we've got to think about the individual. What is it that makes one individual act very differently, one circumstance compared to another? So these are the things I've tried to sort of grapple with in my book. And I think particularly to try and cut against ideas that everything's just down to biology. We can call that biological reductionism. But equally, I think you get some people, and I think this is more common on the left, who think we can ignore biology and it's really just about environment, and we are a bit like a blank slate, that everything that happens to us is, biology really doesn't matter. It's the environment that makes the key difference. So I want to try and find a way to go beyond these, what I think consider kind of two extremes, really, and think about, well, how can biology and environment both play a role in the way we turn out, and also our ability to change. And I think the one thing that really inspired me to write the book was actually something that inspired me to become a Marxist in the first place, really, was reading an essay by Frederick Engels about human evolution. Now, many people in the world will have no idea at all about Engels' role in this. Is if they'll know him at all, is as a kind of an activist, a political activist and thinker. But actually, Engels came up with the first plausible model of human evolution, and at the time, even Darwin didn't really grasp the correct sequence. But we now know this is the true sequence. And this is shown here, which is essentially the fact that our ancestors came out of the trees for whatever reason. There was maybe some pressure that pushed them out of the trees onto the savannah, and then started to walk on two legs. And this walking on two legs then freed up the hands for using tools. And although some other animals use tools, I would argue that systematic use of tools and development of new technologies and new tools in each generation are what really distinguish human beings. And that wasn't an individual thing. Using tools to transform the world around us was very much a social thing. And that social interaction, using tools to transform the environment, Engels then argued led to language, and language and tool use together play the key role in the development of the human brain. So we saw this dramatic expansion of the human brain compared to other apes. And I would argue also there's been a big change in the structure and even the biology of the brain. So the thing that other person really or two people that really inspired me to try and write a book about this subject was a couple of thinkers who worked after the Russian Revolution, actually for quite a brief period. One was a guy called Lev Vygotsky, and if you want to learn more about his life and times, Shirley Franklin has written a very good book that you can get from Bookmarks about Vygotsky. And he basically took on Engels' idea about tools allowing us to transform the world around us. But he says, well, imagine that language itself is a kind of internal tool that actually can transform our brains in the same ways as tools transform the environment, the world around us. And then another thinker, Valentin Voloshinov, who also worked in Russia at the time, developed more this idea that words have a major role in how our consciousness kind of both developed evolutionary, but also as we develop as individuals, as we grow up as children. And I can talk more about exactly how we did that in the discussion if people are interested. But these people weren't around for long. Vygotsky died of TB very early in life, died in the 1930s, and Valentin Voloshinov was imprisoned in one of Stalin's gulags and died there. Now, I'm not the first person to have written a book about Vygotsky. I've already mentioned Shirley's book. What I wanted to do in this book, which I think hasn't really been done before, is to try and take Vygotsky's basic idea about the importance of language in transforming the human brain and the way it works, and then try and find what evidence I could from modern neuroscience. So thinking about the neurons, and there's also these things called glial cells in the brain, and how their function might have radically changed in the human brain compared to other species. And also there's some very interesting evidence now looking at studies now looking at the way in which the genome of individual cells in the brain is affected in a big way by the environment. And I would argue there's been some big change in the way the genome works in humans compared to other species. And what I wanted to do in the book was to then take that basic framework and say, well, what can it tell us about human thought or memory or creativity or imagination? And I'm arguing, throughout the book, that there's been a radical change in all these different things in a way that makes us very unique compared to other species. It's not that we don't have things in common with other species, but I would say there's been a radical shift. That's why the book's called Mindshift, in the way we think. Now, another important aspect of thinking about how the mind works, I think, is that we can't forget there is a subconscious mind. And in fact, the idea of the unconscious has been quite a controversial issue. So particularly people think of Sigmund Freud. In my book, I argue that in many ways, Freud's very much a product of his time, and many of his ideas are quite crude, kind of, some of his ideas about sex we'd consider very backward now. But I think what is important about Freud is this idea of a dynamic aspect to the mind, and one in which we're not always in control of what we think. So we might think we are thinking a thought for a particular reason, but actually there's a lot of unconscious things going on there, and that has relevance in terms of the way ideas change and struggle, because people may be held back by unconscious biases, against black people or gays or trans people or whatever, and we have to try and explain why that might be. And I think we have to think about how the unconscious plays a role in that. Another issue that's dear to my heart, partly because in my own family we've had a lot of mental disorder that's affected my family. My sister committed suicide, is so-called mental disorders. Some people call them illness, some people call them distress. I've picked disorder because I think it's a term that, well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's like an illness in a kind of a biological sense, but it does leave a place there for potential role of biology. And I think one thing we're starting to realize is that a lot of the labels that we give, depression, schizophrenia, autism, they have a usefulness in a sense, in that they can try and help us to understand a bit more about what's the base of these disorders. But the more we learn about these so-called disorders, the more we're starting to learn that although there may be biological links, there are genetic links there, it's an incredibly complex one. And what really matters is the society that a person grows up in, and the traumas and the kind of things that happen to me in that society, and in the families under that kind of society that have a major impact. And so I look at ways we can try and understand the biology, but also how the social pressures can make someone succumb to a particular disorder. And again, trying to sort of move away from this idea that it's either just biology or it's all just environment. And I think one thing we're starting to learn is actually they're very intimately interlinked. So trauma, social trauma through dysfunctional families can have an impact on the biology of the brain, and there's a clear link there. And I think the other thing we're starting to understand is that some of these disorders, for instance autism, although they're defined as disorders, actually they may carry them very positive features as well. Now, we don't want to overdo this, because I think there's a tendency these days to, in a very good way, I think, to say, well, autism, all these positive kind of characteristics. You might want to think of someone like, say, Greta Thunberg. She's autistic, and yet she's for me, a really inspiring person, talking about the climate crisis and cutting through the bullshit, as she calls it, of politicians. Equally, I think we've got to be careful though, because there are some severely autistic individuals who I think need help in potentially quite a different way. And I don't think we should skim over some of the difficulties some people have with that spectrum. I'm not going to skim over serial killers and things like that, but if you want to read about what I think about the really dysfunctional man, you know, the psychopaths and that kind of thing, then you might be interested to read that chapter in the book. But what I thought would be most interesting really to the audience tonight is the way we can try and understand how ideas can change and struggle. And also the fact that how ideas are affected by the fact we live in a class society, because, you know, for most of the majority of our species time on Earth, we've lived in hunter-gatherer groups, egalitarian societies where there really weren't any divisions. You know, there were, all right, there were different roles for men and women to some extent, but there was never a sense of the women being unequal to men. There was no sense of, you know, people being discriminated against on the basis of their color or their sexuality or anything like that. But clearly that's a major part of capitalism, and I would argue that it's one of the ways in which capitalism kind of maintains control. Also, another thing I look at, which is a very Marxist concept, is this idea of alienation, that we are alienated from society and even from the things we produce. And all this has a big impact on our minds and the way they develop, and the kind of illnesses and disorders that we can succumb to. And ultimately, it's also about how ideas can change and struggle. So I look at some of the, you know, major movements in the past revolutions and look at, well, what happened in those circumstances? How did ideas change? And can we then link that to what we're starting to learn about how the brain works? Now, I mentioned language as being a kind of key thing in terms of transforming the brain, but I think we've also got to be aware that there's a lot more to what Vygotsky called cultural tools. So language is one cultural tool, but we have others. We have art, we have music, we have literature. All these have a big impact on the way we develop as individuals, our exposure to these. And also, I would argue, you know, we can start to try and understand some of the ways that some of these things like art, music, and literature affect us as individuals, but by thinking about the particular kind of, you know, neural impulses that may have been going on when those people created those great works. And in a similar way, with science and technology, we also often think of scientists as being this kind of race apart, peculiar people, a bit kind of quirky, you know, not really your average sort of person. But actually, science is as much a part of human society as the arts, really. And I look at ways in which society and the way it's developed under capitalism, but also the way our consciousness develops, has an impact on science, and also not just the way that science develops, but the particular pressures that guide its development under capitalism in particular. And I think what the theme I mentioned earlier on, actually, about alienation, is key really when we start to think about what might be there in the future, because as I said, one of the central points about Marx's view of alienation is that the particular way that society is structured under capitalism means that people can be very alienated from the things that they produce. It can seem as if the things that they produce can almost be like an enemy acting against them, rather than just something that human beings create, because we are so alienated from our work because of the way we're forced to work in a very capitalistic way. And I think this is important when we start to think about issues like, you know, some people have been predicting that artificial intelligence will soon take over the world, computers will turn on us, robots will be killing us in the streets. And I think that kind of reflects, I wouldn't like to minimize the possibilities for artificial intelligence, but I think it overstates the differences between a computer and a human brain. And I think it also is part of this business of being alienated from the things we produce. Things that really should help us, you know, could reduce the workload, should allow us to have more leisure time, actually can seem to be a threat. Now, that's not to say that if an AI system is used in a war to kill people and murder people, that's not a threat, but that's very much a human interaction. That's a human relationship. It's the generals and the armies that are actually using these things in that murderous way, not some computer that's gone off on its own and decided to go around killing people. And I think the other thing I've tried to really look at in the sort of later stage of the book is, well, what's the meaning of it all? You know, because it can often seem in the society we live under, what is the point of it all? You know, and particularly if you're a materialist and you don't have a religious point of view, that can seem to be the case. And so I thought it was important really to look at the ways in which we find meaning in the world, and in particular that means thinking back to what's our real species difference, this ability to transform the world around us and interact with others. And for me, that's the key to being human. And often in a capitalist society, we kind of denied that with those real possibilities to have control over our lives, and so on and so forth. And that really brings me to my final point, really, which is that one thing I think we really should be proud of as human beings is the amazing things we've done as a species. It's part of us all, in a sense, that we've gone from, living in caves 40,000 years ago to sending rockets to, Mars and beyond, our great cities, our transport systems, all these amazing things that we've created. And yet you only have to look at the state of things at the moment to see that, for all our great achievements and unique qualities compared to other species, we're heading for disaster. You'd have to be a fool, I think, not to recognize the real, how fast things are moving, how clear we're heading for a disaster in terms of the global warming and the effect on the environment. So it's all about really then thinking, well, how can we kind of use our species' ability to try and move to a very different kind of society, an ethical, sustainable society. And obviously that means it's not really a major subject of the book, but I talk about revolutions. But clearly, it's one of the key questions is how can we move from a capitalist society, which is not just unfair and unequal and bad in that sense, but it's also an unsustainable system. So how can we move from that to a socialist society? And of course, that's more of a political question, but it does raise questions about how ideas can change and struggle, and how we're going to get from A now to B, the socialist future. So thank you for listening to this bit of the talk.